Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Asset Management Ontario for the invitation to present, as well as the previous speakers for their engaging presentations. So Chitra and I are going to be speaking to a natural asset management project in the Grindstone Creek watershed. This project started in 2019, so actually before COVID, for those of you who remember that time, and is wrapping up in the coming months. So just to give you an indication of the flow of today's presentation, I will start by making the case for asset management, natural asset management, and briefly describe the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative's approach to that. Then I'll pass it over to Chitra, who's going to dive into the Grindstone Creek watershed project. So while this project isn't yet completed, there's some important findings to share, including the importance of a watershed scale and some foundational building blocks for a successful project. Then we will both share our insights into the role of natural assets in a changing climate, and I'll wrap up with some next steps and conclusions. And of course, we'll aim to allow some time for Q&A. Okay, so starting with the case for natural assets, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or MNAI, is a relatively young, not-for-profit organization made up of a small team and a board of directors. And we recognize that nature is one of our most vital infrastructure assets. So natural assets such as forests, wetlands, or open green spaces contribute to delivering essential services that we rely on every day. Services like clean drinking water, clean air, and flood management. And importantly, they're also central to any climate resilient infrastructure system. So we need to treat our natural assets like core infrastructure. Now, fortunately, natural assets can be managed, and the bottom left picture there is from Gibson's, BC, where you can see they're doing some work on one of their ponds to increase its ability for stormwater conveyance. But unfortunately, because our natural assets don't appear in spreadsheets or financial statements, because we don't recognize that they're scarce resources, they're often overused and under-recognized. So why is it important to manage natural assets? And I'm sure I'm not going to be saying anything that folks here aren't already well aware of, but there's two overarching reasons for this. One has to do with the state of our built infrastructure. So not surprisingly, local governments are feeling squeezed because they're managing 60% of our infrastructure with just 10 to 12 cents of every dollar. Now, a large portion of our infrastructure in Canada is nearing the end of its useful life. Significant investments that were made during the 1950s and 60s is now approaching 60 to 70 years old. And with this aging infrastructure, municipalities can expect an increase in maintenance and operating costs and significant increases for renewal and replacement costs in the near future. Now add to this climate change. Climate change is creating more extreme weather events more often. In many communities we've worked in, what used to be a 1 in 50-year storm event can now happen several times a week. And in 2017 alone, more than 160 billion liters of raw sewage overflowed from combined sewer systems. So this means existing stormwater management systems are not handling downpours effectively. And just a few images here to drive home the point. The left image is from the recent floods in Quebec from about 2 years ago. The one on the right is in a community we've worked with on Vancouver Island, Courtenay, BC, where they're really squeezed between the ocean and a river system. So they're experiencing both that coastal and riverine flooding. Now, the good news is that municipalities are now mandated to practice asset management. It's really an integrated, systematic process to meet required service levels in the most cost-effective manner by managing assets for present and future generations. So it really embraces a life cycle approach, strives for continuous improvement in asset management practices. And a logical extension of the asset management approach is the inclusion of natural assets. That's because it really complements the forward-thinking solutions of asset management plans. Now, Municipal Natural Asset Initiative's approach really aligns with the Asset Management BC framework, which is based on current international best practices, as well as practices that have been developed and endorsed by local government practitioners. Their framework really focuses on desired outcomes rather than prescribing specific methodologies, which in turn allows local governments to develop and implement an approach that can be adapted to their unique conditions. The framework further describes asset management as a process and provides a guidance to the what and the why of asset management with a high-level overview of the how. So we've really taken our guidance from them. The image in the center of the slide here is from Asset Management BC, and we've simply added an additional ring around the outside to tie in natural asset management. Now, one other point I want to make here is that the emphasis on asset management, whatever province you're in, is on sustainable service delivery, as opposed to the underlying asset that delivers that service, which means that natural capital can form a core element of municipal asset management strategies. That's because this natural capital may provide or could be restored to provide ecosystem services that the community relies on. So from the lens of a local government, this natural capital forms a class of natural assets that deliver municipal services similar to engineered assets. Okay, so our approach really strives to answer those common questions that asset managers tend to ask. Questions like, what is the inventory of your natural assets? Where is it located? What is its extent? What is the condition of your assets, and can they be improved? What risks do your natural assets face? And as you start to dig into them, do you have undocumented liabilities? What is its value? If you lost those services and they had to be replaced, what would that cost you? How will it respond to changes in demand, such as climate change or development pressures? And how will local governments maintain it over time? So to answer these questions, we bring multidisciplinary teams to complete place-based modeling and economic analysis. But importantly, we work closely with project partners who provide the data needed and help us to really flesh out those how methodologies. And their involvement is essential for providing local knowledge, context, experience in those relationships. So over the past 6 years, we've worked with communities across Canada to complete natural asset management projects. Some of these have been restricted to that first fundamental step of asset management, developing natural asset inventories. And by the end of this year, we will have worked with over 30 communities to do that. Some have been full asset management projects where we've worked with towns or municipalities to understand the role of natural assets in stormwater management or in mitigating coastal erosion and the impacts of storm surge and sea level rise. And now we're working with multiple communities at a watershed scale, which is really the appropriate ecological scale for managing natural assets. And so we're pleased to be piloting this work with a very knowledgeable and engaged group of partners in the Grindstone Creek. And today we're going to dig into this project a little. So I'm going to turn it over to Chitra to discuss some key foundational building blocks for a successful project.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to continue over the next few slides So when we began the Grindstone Creek Natural Assets Management project, there were definitely some key points, and these are the foundational building blocks of a natural asset management project. So on this slide, I'm just going to speak a little bit more about the importance of the partnerships. When planning for a natural assets management project, definitely determining the local people and the partnerships, including where to get the natural asset data sources, is one of those foundational elements to a successful project. So just as an example with the Grindstone Creek project, the MNAI, or the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, provides a high-level framework and guidance around the natural asset management. The municipalities with this project carry out a very obvious and significant role in stormwater management, climate change resiliency. They also have to deal with aged infrastructure, as Michelle pointed out earlier, and climate change impacts. Many of our municipalities have climate action plans or strategies in place. So many of them have declared climate change emergencies. It's also important to know the relevant provincial policy frameworks in place. So for example, in Ontario, the obvious one is the Ontario Regulation 58817 for municipal asset management plans. And of course, here the opportunity is to incorporate natural assets into the regular asset management planning process. Ontario's conservation authorities are watershed-based organizations, and they contribute to natural asset management and nature-based solutions. They've been doing this for over many decades through watershed management programs and services. And these include managing the GIS data for natural assets, so the Geographic Information System data, maintaining our natural assets, assessing the condition of natural assets like wetlands, rivers, and creeks, stewardship and restoration programs, monitoring, green infrastructure, and other programs and services. Next slide, please. Another foundational block to a successful natural asset management project, especially when you're looking at the wetlands and the floodplains and so on and so forth from a stormwater management function, is looking at a project from a watershed scale. A quick recap on what a watershed is. It is simply an area of land that catches the rain and snow and then drains it to one water body like a lake or a river. The watershed scale is key to effectively studying natural assets like wetlands and floodplains, because you'll be better able to understand the stormwater management function, the water quality services they provide, and flood mitigation. And so watershed management collaboratively supports climate change mitigation and adaptation actions that help build resiliency. On this slide, you can see a map of Conservation Halton watershed. Its jurisdiction is about 1,000 square kilometers from the headwaters through the Niagara Escarpment down to Lake Ontario. So it does drain to Lake Ontario. Now our project of focus here is the Grindstone Creek watershed, which is about 1/10 of the size of the Conservation Halton watershed. So it's about 90 kilometers squared. It drains into the Hamilton Harbor, Burlington Bay area, right at the Royal Botanical Gardens. And most of the land is rural residential, agriculture, and open space, with a few spots of urban settlement areas as well. Let's go deeper into the natural assets project with Grindstone Creek. So on our next slide, of course, is just going back to the importance of the partnerships. All of the people and organizations that have made this project happen, starting with the proponent organization, the MNAI, and going through with the municipalities, the City of Burlington, City of Hamilton, and also the Royal Botanical Gardens, and the Greenbelt Foundation, which is one of the project funders. And of course, last but not least is the organization that I work with, Conservation Halton, which was one of Ontario's 36 conservation authorities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with the Grindstone Creek Watershed Project, we had a few main objectives, and the 8-point step process that Michelle took you through for a natural assets management project, I've condensed into 4 steps here. So in the figure that you see here, that's an actual picture of our lovely Grindstone Creek. And I summarized the overall tasks into the 4 that you see here. The natural asset inventory and assessments, the science piece, And then the services evaluation, which includes modeling. And this is where the climate change angle is applied as well. And with these two pieces, they are a nice lead into the economic valuation of the natural assets. And that leads into incorporating natural assets into the regular asset management planning process. Next slide, please. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of these steps, the steps that we've actually completed so far for the Grindstone Creek Watershed Project. The first step, of course, is the natural assets inventory. And so the natural assets for Grindstone Creek, the rivers, the creeks, the forest areas, the wetlands, and so on, were all collected from the different organizations, including Conservation Halton, the Royal Botanical Gardens, and the cities of Hamilton and Burlington. The MNAI was able to take that information and combine it and process the geographic information system data layers to form one complete data set that can be used easily. And they were also able to develop a really good interactive dashboard. They've used a software called Power BI, and we've got a screenshot of that actually on this specific slide. With this interactive dashboard, you can move around within the subwatershed itself, and you can also look at the results from some of those assessments, the conditions and the risk assessments, and also have a look at the level of service of the natural assets. Next slide, please. So just going through a few more steps that we've completed so far with the Grindstone Creek Watershed Project. The second pillar here speaks to the conditions and risk assessments. A lot of science-based work there. The methodologies to undertake the condition and risk assessments came from the MNAI, Conservation Halton, and different literature resources. So for example, getting to know the condition of, for example, a wetland and ranking that from 1 to 10, going from poor to excellent, and making sure that we apply the right methods. Is the wetland, for example, adjacent to built-up areas, or is it adjacent to other natural open space areas? So all of these factor into how the conditions of each natural asset is assessed. For the risk assessments, I do have to say that it was quite a learning experience. So conservation authorities and of course municipalities look at flood risks as those that are posed to life and property. With the Natural Assets Project, the MNAI was able to retrain us to think about things differently. So we were looking, for example, as flood posing a risk to the function of a natural asset. For example, its ability to provide stormwater or flood mitigation itself. And so it's quite a new concept. And then there were other methods that we're able to borrow from existing methodology, for example, the Conservation Authority watershed report cards. The third pillar here speaks to the level of service. And there's a lot of modeling being undertaken by the MNAI. The model scenarios were determined by all of the project partners, and we're pretty excited to be seeing the results of this level of service work. And this is where the climate change lens is being applied. So we are looking at extreme weather events and how that's playing out within the watershed, what it means for the natural assets, and so on. And we really are applying more of an adaptation lens within the level of service box here. And that leads to the next step, which is the economic valuation. Lots of literature out there, and the MNAI has provided some really good methods to determine the costing. The outcomes that we expect at this stage, where we have actually been seeing some preliminary results, is the asset replacement costs, the natural assets where they're providing core services, flood mitigation, stormwater management, water quality controls, and also looking at the operation and maintenance costs for those core services. What we also want to get out of this stage, and Michelle will describe this in detail, are the co-services that our natural assets provide. So for example, carbon storage. And so these really get into the mitigation side of our natural assets. The MNAI provides lots of meeting discussion time for all of this to happen with all of the project partners taking place in the discussions. And of course, the project partners providing the local knowledge, the context, and the experience needed to undertake the natural assets management project. Speaking of the MNAI and the project partners, I'm actually going to hand it back to Michelle for the next few slides.
Sure. Thank you, Chitra. So our projects have traditionally incorporated climate change adaptation, and that's generally done through the modeling. So in the Grindstone Creek project, we completed modeling to understand variables like peak flow and infiltration. And here I just have a screenshot of the model. We also complete scenario modeling to understand local climate projections, so and how they will affect levels of service. So previous results of our work has revealed that intact natural assets are in fact much more adaptable, resilient to climate change than engineered infrastructure is, which often requires upgrades or replacements. Natural assets do tend to be less carbon intensive to construct. They increase in value over time and of course provide a range of additional benefits. So it's just one note that of course this isn't the full story on adaptation. Adaptive capacity can be driven by a range of institutional, technological, and cultural factors, and certainly there's more work to dig into there. Now, before I move over to the mitigation piece, I wanted to address, the broader contributions of natural assets. Really, in our work, we're generally quite focused on those core services that local governments are mandated to provide. But a key aspect of natural assets is this wider range of benefits. So we have started to value additional benefits in our watershed studies beyond those core services local governments are mandated to provide, but we do so without modeling. So practically, this means that the resulting values are not tied to measured levels of service, but they do provide that wider, broader picture. So in this project, we worked with our project partners to identify those additional benefits of relevance and importance. And we landed on 7 key benefits for further exploration. Now, some of these were able to address quantitatively, benefits such as recreation and tourism, soil retention and erosion control, climate mitigation, habitat for species, and water quality. Other services we chose to address qualitatively because the studies really just aren't there, or they're not suitable to be transferred to the region. So these included the physical and mental health benefits associated with nature, probably something that many of us have grown to appreciate even more over the last year, and the significance of the watershed for Indigenous values. Okay. So of course, in addition to those climate adaptation benefits of natural assets, they can have mitigation benefits as well and act as really a carbon sink, both because they may be deferring the construction of gray infrastructure and because they may be storing and sequestering carbon. So overall, I'd say communities are just starting to dig into this piece, and us as well. Recently, the David Suzuki Foundation and the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative partnered on a bit of a scoping exercise to understand the impacts of natural assets on community greenhouse gas portfolios. And of particular interest for us is how carbon accounting can help municipalities build that business case to protect their natural assets by examining and quantifying their mitigation potential. So to do this, we did a bit of a literature scan, but also reached out to local governments as well as some provincial governments across the country. The high-level kind of literature review told us that the mitigation potential of natural assets is available, but the data is generally at a national or a global scale and not useful for decision-making at the local scale. We found that greenhouse gas accounting protocols are available for the voluntary market, but are applicable for larger scale projects and generally not used by municipalities. what was really valuable was talking to a range of local government leaders, and what we found there was that there is quite strong interest in understanding this side, the mitigation side of the puzzle. The reasons varied. Certainly some communities really were interested in incorporating this into greenhouse gas inventories and targets. Some really wanted the information to manage development or to build the case for natural asset management. So quite a range of reasons. We found that the needs are different for small and medium-sized municipalities than for larger municipalities, where larger municipalities often have the capacity to do this in-house. And we found that the greenhouse gas potential of natural assets certainly varies according to community size and whether it's more urbanized or rural. What we also found was that there's some key leaders in this area where we can build from their work. So NGOs and conservation authorities really stood out. There was also recognition of the role of Indigenous leaders and academic researchers, and how do we enable that? So with that, maybe I'll just turn it over to Chitra to give us a bit of an example of some of the work that's been done in Conservation Halton.
Thanks, Michelle. So just to segue right off of what Michelle was talking about in terms of the mitigation services provided by our natural assets, Conservation Halton has a strategic forest management plan. Now this management plan is very, very critical because properly managed forests are good sinks for carbon. They provide adequate carbon storage and sequestration services. So it is important to have those management plans in place for forested areas. You can see that I provided a couple of definitions for carbon storage and carbon sequestration separately. But in general, they are linked, and in general, carbon sequestration is usually a long-term form of carbon storage. And so far, our estimates, our preliminary estimates for Conservation Halton properties for forested areas, the carbon storage is anywhere between about 2 to just under 4 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, and carbon sequestration over 8,000 tons carbon dioxide equivalents per year. We were able to use a publication by the David Suzuki Foundation. It's a popular one from 2012 called Carbon in the Bank, and it's about Ontario's green belt and its role in climate change mitigation. So we used some estimates there and calculated that the monetary value of the carbon stored on the forested areas for the Conservation Halton properties is over $2.5 million per year. So that's your estimate so far, and we'll continue to estimate these numbers and include those within our climate change adaptation and mitigation plans. So I just wanted to provide these examples to you, and Michelle, I'm going to hand it right back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've been throwing a lot of information to you, so I thought it might be useful to provide some conclusions that we've drawn from our work. The first is asset management is a useful platform for the management of natural assets. The end goal of all of our projects is really to see the integration of natural assets into core asset management and financial processes using the same systems as is used for engineered assets, so it doesn't feel like you're doing two different things in a community. The second is that strong partnerships are foundational to successful projects. And what we found at MNAI is that project development and implementation is as much about stakeholder engagement, building collaborative capacity and consensus, and effective change management as it is about technological methodologies and tools. Third, managing natural assets at a watershed scale is key to effectively understanding and studying natural assets, and I think Chitra has spoken quite well to this. And then last, natural asset management is still evolving. There are a handful of groups across the country that is doing this sort of work and creating strong projects and tools. So in Ontario, you have groups like Green Infrastructure Ontario, for example, that's doing some really great work. There's a strong foundation and some great instructive case studies to build on. And then I thought I'd wrap it up with some next steps. So in addition to giving you an idea of where we're going with this project, I thought I'd touch upon some upcoming work that's being released that might be of interest to these folks on this call. So the Grindstone project is nearing completion. We're aiming for completion this summer. And then coming out of that, ideally the outputs will support watershed management approaches for climate change resiliency. And it's anticipated that the project could be replicated across other watersheds in the region. Secondly, MNAI is undertaking a project to move municipalities kind of one step towards effective implementation through the development of a level of service framework for natural assets and ecosystem services. And I think this is important and might be of interest to folks because it really represents that link between higher level organizational objectives and the more detailed technical and operational objectives of infrastructure management. And then lastly, I thought I'd flag an upcoming document that we completed with engineers and geoscientists of BC that is engineering norms for natural assets that will really focus on describing why it's important to integrate natural assets into local government asset management practices and how natural asset considerations fit into the broader process. I believe UBC is developing some curriculum in this fall for this, and I think it's probably an example of an enabling kind of document that could be readily transferred to Ontario. So with that, I really want to thank you for your attention, and perhaps I'll open it up for questions.